My name is Richard Ottalagano, and I live at 27 Lee Avenue in Gloversville. And I think that my experiences are a little different than most of the veterans that have taken part in this program, and in that I was involved in the Cold War. I was born during World War II and grew up being told that the safest place to be during a nuclear attack would be underneath my desk in school. Well, I wasn't very old before I realized that that little wooden desk wasn't going to stop very much, and became determined that if there was going to be a war at some point in time, that I wanted to be in a position where I could fight back. So upon graduating Gloversville High School in 1961, I joined the new U.S. Navy and went to training at Great Lakes Naval Training Center, and from there at Great Lakes Naval Training Center also attended Radar A School. My first duty assignment after A School was aboard the, I can't remember the name of the ship because I was there such a short time, but it was a destroyer out of Jacksonville, Florida. And during that period of time, the destroyers, the majority of the destroyers in the Navy were of a World War II vintage, and they were being upgraded in what they called the FRAM program. So this ship that I was assigned to, of course, I had a very, very short stay on there, just about long enough to unpack my sea bag and find out that I was being shipped to Charleston, South Carolina to join the USS Bordelon, which was another destroyer in that same class. The Bordelon wasn't a happy ship for me. There were some sad experiences there. All my petty officers were Southerners. They had no use for New York Guinea. And so it was kind of a rough road to hoe. I did find some friends there though, and did have a pretty good time. And one night I was on Liberty in Charleston and had a few drinks, and the Navy Y, all your service towns had a serviceman's YMCA, had bunks there available for people to sleep. So I paid the price for a bunk, and I went to sleep. I woke up the next morning, the place was empty, and I wondered what had happened. So I went down to the desk and I inquired down there, and he says, oh, the shore patrol came during the night. They must have missed you. They got all the servicemen and sent them back to their bases and their ships. And really, what's going on? I said, we don't know. It's just, this town is dead. So I jumped in a cab and I went back to the base, and I went to the pier where my ship and the other ships in the squadron, the destroyers, were berthed, and only seen one destroyer there, the EA Green, which was hull number 711. I'll never forget that. And I says, well, what do I do? Well, I said, well, this is a ship in my squadron. Maybe they can tell me what's going on. So I went down to the quarterdeck and asked the officer of the deck what was going on, told him who I was and what ship I was on. And he says, oh, you came to the right place. He says, we're picking up stragglers. I said, stragglers for what? And he said, never mind, you'll find out. So we got on board, and the ship got underway, and we headed south. Along the way, we fell into a formation guarding the Enterprise. The Enterprise at that time was the world's newest and biggest ship. It was nuclear powered, state-of-the-art. Our duty was to protect it from potential submarines and pick up down flyers and things like that. We found out where we were going then, and found out that President Kennedy had had enough of Khrushchev threatening to bring Russian missiles into Cuba, and we were going to be taking part with what is now known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. So along the way, we did come across a submarine contact. The Green and another destroyer broke off and pinned the submarine down while the Enterprise was escaping. We joined back up with the Enterprise, and from there I was lifted off the fantail by means of a yoke, which goes around your body like this, and lifted up in the air by the helicopter. And off a destroyer, it's quite an experience because you're slingshotted up in the air. They don't want to take a chance of getting tangled up in the mast or anything involved with a rocking destroyer, which is like a cork in a bathtub on the ocean. I was brought to the Enterprise, landed on the flight deck, and from there we ran down to the hangar deck, and we were going to be highlined to the truckee. Well, it was just a matter of following orders, because I didn't have time to ask questions. It just go, go, go. I was loaded into what's called the bosun's chair to be highlined to another ship. Now, just a brief description of this is that this is a line that's stretched between the ships, and there's a bosun's chair on it. There's crews on either ship pulling the line, depending on which way you're going, or giving slack. Well, these were two pretty large ships, and about halfway across, the ships yawned together in a trough, and I was heading towards the water at a pretty fast rate of speed, and it looked like I was going to be getting a saltwater bath. Just about then, the ships rolled the other way, and I was shot into the air, all the time still in the bosun's chair, at an unprecedented rate of speed. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I've never been in an amusement park that's had a thrill ride like that since. There's been none that's awed me since then. Well, anyways, I got aboard the truckie, and for the first time in quite a while, I had a place to sleep, because on the green, there wasn't even room for us to sleep. We had to sleep on the decks. My bunk was in the brig, which they left the door unlocked for me, of course, and I got a night's sleep in a bunk on our way to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Once in Cuba, we got off the ship, and we were told they were going to issue us M1s and put us on the perimeter guarding the base. I was a little bit concerned about that, not having an awful lot of combat training, just a minimal amount that's necessary for a sailor to have. But instead, they brought us to the airstrip and loaded us on planes to fly us back to the United States and then eventually meet up with our ships. Well, the planes at that time that was used for military transport were DC-3s. I forgot what the military designation of them was, but that's what they were, as DC-3s. Two-engine planes. They were stripped on the inside. There wasn't even any insulation. There was just the outer skin. That's what your benches were leaning against, is the outer skin of the plane. So, well, we took off. We got in the air, and of course had to hit a storm. So the storm comes up. The commander of the aircraft, he tells us that he's going to have to go a little bit higher to avoid the bad weather, and our cabin wasn't pressurized, and try to go to sleep if you can, because if not, you're going to suffer from lack of oxygen. But at the same time, he also told us that we were going to pass through a little bit of Cuban airspace, and that there was a danger that we might be attacked. Now, I'd ask anybody, try to sleep when you realize that you're on an unarmed plane, that at any minute a MiG-15 or 19 is going to come streaming out of the clouds with his cannons flaring at you. Of course, needless to say, none of us slept. Well, we landed in Boca Chica, Florida, and we got off the plane, and from there went to the naval station in Key West, and waited for our ships to come in. Now, if anybody's ever been in Key West, they know that that's probably the hottest point in the United States, as far as on the East Coast anyways. The temperature down there when I got there was in the hundreds. If we did try to take a dip in the ocean, it was like being stewed in a stew pot, because the ocean temperature was the same temperature. Well, my ship finally came back in. It was on blockade duty, and as I said, that was the borderline. We did get joined back to our ships and proceeded on the Cuban blockade. Now, there was one firing instance that I know of in the entire action, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I got to witness that. And that was my real first Cold War experience, I should say. We were spread out in formation around Cuba. There was a ring of iron, a ring of American ships around Cuba, keeping these freighters out with the missiles. When one of the ships in my squadron had a contact approaching, and it was a Russian freighter, we were able, from the bridge of my ship, to see the whole action, and it was quite a distance, but of course at sea you got a line of vision that's unimpaired. We seen the flashing lights on the destroyer USS Vassals signaling the freighter to stop, to turn about. The Russian freighter, continued to ignore it, no matter how many times it was flashed. Then we seen a flashing light from the destroyer saying, "Halt, or you will be fired on." And again, this was ignored. So the next thing we see is a flash of bright light coming from one of their guns, and we hear a boom a few seconds later, and a flashing light saying the next one will be through your wheelhouse. All of a sudden, the Russian ship was a beehive of activity. They understood English perfectly and knew how to signal very rapidly, and the message was, "We are stopping, we are stopping, we are stopping." And the Russian freighter, of course, stopped and turned about and didn't get through. During that crisis also, we had some pretty unsettling experiences. We knew of the Soviets' Komars, which were a fast motor torpedo boat. They were a little bit too fast for us to handle, we thought at that time, because our fire controls radars couldn't lock on fast enough, and also low-flying MiGs. We had very little in the way of air defense. If it was World War II with prop German planes, of course we could have defended ourselves, but at this point in history, the ships, the destroyers, didn't have the armament necessary to fight off air attack unassisted. Well, one day we were out there, and sure enough, they buzzed us. And our fire control radar didn't lock on it. And it was long gone before we had even a chance to lock our guns on it. So we knew that if there was a war, that we would have been the first casualties. They would have took us out. Well, the crisis ended, and the ship returned to its home base in Charleston. And I was doubly joyed in that we had actually stared the Russians down, President Kennedy being the man he was, and had keeping us out of harm's way with the armed forces. And I was transferred to the Diocese. Well, the Diocese was a happy ship for me. I worked for two excellent first-class petty officers. They didn't have any of the bigotry associated with some of the southern petty officers. One was the name of Kosnicki, and the other was the name of Sanchez. So it's easy to see that diversity was part of their life, and they understood it. I felt I had a home there working for these two wonderful men. One day I was coming down through the midships passageway, and I was going by the first class lounge. Now, the first class lounge on that type of destroyer is about as big as the average bathroom in a house. So, I mean, to say there isn't much space in there. And my first class petty officer, Kosnicki, stuck his head out the door and he says, "Ah," that's what they called me because the first two initials of my name. And he says, come here, President Kennedy got killed." And I go, "Go on, Ski, you gotta be kidding me." He says, "No, come on in here, come on in here." Well, we went in there, and we've seen it on the TV, and we loved President Kennedy. We thought a lot of him. I think a lot of us volunteered for the armed forces. The group that left Fulton County for the armed forces was the biggest group to ever join the Navy. And here's part of the company that, this is just part of the guys that came from this area, and a lot of them are still in the area. We're still in contact, the ones that are outside the area. A lot of us graduated in the class of 1961, and it was the largest group ever to come out of this area in peacetime, of course, to join the Navy. But anyways, we went on a wartime footing. The president had been assassinated. We didn't know why. The armed forces were alerted, and wow, this is it. You know, the Russians did something to us, and we're going to fight back. As we eventually found out, it was the work of a deranged person that the president was assassinated. Now, my life aboard the Diocese was happy. I got to go on a Mediterranean cruise, got to see a lot of the ports in that part of the world, and returning back to the United States, that ship was destined to go in the yards for a Fram overhaul, and I was then assigned to my last ship, which was the R.E. Krause, and I do happen to have a picture of it after the Fram conversion, and this is the cruise book that from that ship with the picture. The Krause was a Sling-class ship, but when I joined it in the yards, it was in the process of being modernized to with better fire control systems, a different array of weapons as far as anti-submarine warfare. Still not an upgrade as far as air defense, but it was more modern. Well, joining that crew, I was put to work as more or less putting the stores away and cataloging the stores for electronic parts. And I went through all the fun part of taking a ship out of the yards, going on the test runs, the speed runs, and the endurance runs, and things like that, and then a shakedown cruise to Guantanamo Bay, which at that time was peaceful. Not too long after that, we took another Mediterranean cruise, my second, but probably the first for most of the people on that ship. And when we got into the Sixth Fleet, which was the Mediterranean Fleet, we found that we were going to be on detached duty in the Red Sea, Indian Ocean. This is a part of the world at that time American ships weren't seen in very much. Usually there were 2 American destroyers in that whole part of the world, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf. That was all there was 2 American ships. There was a seaplane tender, which we know we didn't use seaplanes during that time, but it was a station ship in Karachi, Pakistan, or something like that. But that was all the presences there was of the American flag in that part of the world. So ours was going to be a good world tour, more or less. So we look forward to that. We went through the Suez Canal and onward down through the east coast of Africa. I've seen some wonderful countries that Americans probably even today don't get to see, like Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, which was the most beautiful country I've ever seen. And we were the first American warship to go to Madagascar in 28 years. And we were actually given a gala affair from their Secretary of State. It was President Adams. It was really quite an experience. Now, coming back and keeping in mind that we're still in the Cold War period, we stopped at Ethiopia again. And Ethiopia was a friend of the United States at the time, whereas Egypt was a client of Russia and the Soviet Union. And the Ethiopians told us, plus we got some intelligence, that there was a brand spanking new Russian destroyer coming down into the Red Sea, Persian Gulf. Part of the duties during the Cold War was to gather as much intelligence as you could. There had been no pictures existing of this destroyer, this Russian-class destroyer, so far. We set a course to intercept with our old tin can, and the Russian ship came into the Red Sea, wanted to be photographed by us. And of course we flashed him a welcome. He says, welcome from the United States Navy to our Red Sea. It was very upsetting to the Russians, as they had all these arrays of antennas and armaments completely uncovered, no canvas over them or anything. And we had a field day taking pictures of this ship, which was an intelligence coup. Well, not too long after that, we needed to go back out of the Suez Canal, back up into the Mediterranean. And when we went into, I believe it's Port Suez, on the bottom part of the Suez Canal, and anchored and waited to go through, we were informed by the Egyptian port authorities that we weren't going to be allowed to go through the Suez Canal, that we were suspected of having contraband aboard our ship, and they wanted to put an armed party aboard our ship, Egyptian soldiers. Well, in the finest traditions of America and the United States Navy, my captain radioed back to him that there's only one way an armed party of foreign nationals will come aboard a United States ship, and that's by force. We immediately went to general quarters. My duty station at that particular time, for that instance, was at the highest flat deck of the ship, and I don't know if you could see it. It's right there. It's the top of the signal bridge. There was a long glass up there, and my position was to look through that long glass. At the shore, were on the ways, was one of the Comars, a motor torpedo boat, which we were quite familiar with from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if that ship moved, I was to yell through the sound power phone, and one of the massive 5-inch guns that you see in the picture would make it into kindling wood. At the same time, anchored nearby us was an Egyptian destroyer. Well, of course, we had that completely outclassed. We had 5-inch guns, they had 3-inch guns, we had more guns than they did, and our armament was thicker. We weren't too worried about that. We thought that we could take that out too. But of greatest concern was, since we were anchored and just getting steam back up, was from small boats carrying soldiers. And as I looked down from my lofty perch throughout the ship, any place I looked, there was a sailor with a sidearm. American ships usually have an armory, and there's small arms in there. Unfortunately, our small arms were of World War II vintage, so we had people armed with M1 carbines, M1s, Thompson submachine guns, and on the O2 level, between the stacks, right in through here, there were sandbag emplacements with 30 caliber air-cooled machine guns. So if they did try to board us, they were going to pay a terrible price. As it was, the standoff went on for several hours, and eventually the Egyptian government backed down. I don't think they wanted an international incident, and they would look the worst of it because we'd give a lot more than what we'd receive. And they apologized to us, and they said it was a mistake, and we went on through the Suez Canal. But what I didn't add in this part is that halfway up the Suez Canal was a massive MiG base. We had counted, actually got a look at it on our way down, of 25, I believe it was, MiG-19s, which were the most modern fighter aircraft in the world at that time. For some reason they didn't decide to send them after us, or else we would have made it back through the Suez Canal. Well, we came out from the Suez Canal, joined the Sixth Fleet, hit a couple of the Mediterranean ports, and then back to the United States. And it wasn't too long after that I was discharged. But I guess being in the Cold War, being part of some of these events, one of them much publicized, one probably unheard of except for the 270-some sailors and 15 officers aboard that ship and a few people in Naval Intelligence and maybe the State Department, gave me kind of a sense of responsibility or a sense of citizenship. And I believe my experience as being an armed forces person has actually molded my life, where God and country comes first. And has always been in a position I try to help anybody that I could. We have the cruise book here from that last cruise. It doesn't have anything in it about the incident that I mentioned. It's got a lot of nice pictures of the various people aboard and things like that. Most of them won't photograph well. But a couple of the shots that I reproduced of my own is this one. And while I was in Aden, one of the ports I visited, I made friends with a gentleman in the RAF and switched uniforms just for a little while to take pictures. And I guess I looked pretty good as one of Her Majesty's airmen. And here's pictures of the ships going through the Suez Canal. And while I was in Kenya, I visited one of the old Portuguese forts. And this is what the gun emplacements and the fortress looked like at that time. Like I said, these are blow-ups of the snapshots that I had took. I also have another picture here of my graduating class from Radar A School. And by then, of course, I looked quite different. I had hair, whereas in basic training I was shaved, and of course now less hair too. And the people I graduated with, well, I never got to see any of them again once I was out in the fleet, because the Navy is so large. One of the memorabilia that I actually had was the Old Navy flat cap. It was issued to us at that era, and part of our sea bag. We had to carry it, but the Navy stopped using it because so many sailors were getting hit by cars when they were dressed in blues and they had no white on them at all. They would reflect light. So they went strictly to the white hat that sailors traditionally wear, the Dixie cups. And so just to protect them. Of course, I'll probably keep this as long as I live and the moths don't get to it. It's 100% wool, and this is a keepsake. Well, that kind of wraps it up for me.
Thank you very much for participating.
Mm-hmm.